All right, guys, welcome back. Session 2 of Intentional Educators, all about identity. Identity matters. All right, I'm Brian Weaver, disciple, speaker, facilitator, and this has been a great joy and pleasure doing my presentation, Intentional Educator, for you guys as you consider your calling and living out your purpose. So in session 1, just a quick review, we talked about life by the numbers, right? That as a pastor, I get 35 to 40 hours in a given year to influence somebody in their life of faith. Coaches and mentors, the people who lead those extracurricular activities get somewhere around 450 hours in a given year to influence students in their life of faith. We talked about you as an educator. You get somewhere around 1,300 hours to influence the students in your classroom and their families. 1,300 hours, which is a tremendous amount of time, okay? Employers, so if you're a principal administrator, you have somewhere around 2,100 hours to influence your team, your organization, to live out a life of faith, all right? And then parents, guardians, somewhere around 3,000 hours to influence the next generation in the life of faith. And we really dived into what that means and why that's important is that I need to use my time to disciple other people for the rest of their lives, right? So as a pastor, as a church worker, if I get 35 to 40 hours, I'm not asking, how do I make more time? How do I try to get people here more often? Instead, my question to myself is, how do I utilize my 35 to 40 hours to impact them the most throughout their life, throughout the rest of their week, when they go home, when they're having conversations with their spouse, when they're having conversations with their kids or their coworkers, whatever it might be. As an educator, how do you use the 1,300 hours that you have this year with the students in your classroom to prepare them for the year to follow, to prepare them for the years that follow, to prepare them for what lays ahead in their journey of faith? And it really comes down to utilizing the most of that time is me growing in my faith so that I can disciple others in theirs. So as a pastor, I utilize my 35 to 40 hours the most by seeking to grow in my faith so that I can disciple others in theirs. As an educator, you can use the most of your 1,300 hours with the students in your classroom by growing first and foremost in your faith as a disciple of our Savior Jesus Christ. And that will disciple your students. It's the promise that He's made. As He grows us, as His Spirit works transformation within us, our lives do reflect that. Our lives do show His grace, His mercy, and His truth. All right, and so we're actually going to dive into that a little bit today in this section. Identity matters. Let's talk about definition of a person. All right, definition of a person. How do you see your students? Perception yields behavior, yields reality. Perception yields behavior, yields reality. What I mean by this is that how we perceive ourselves often determines our behavior, which then creates this reality, whether that is accurate or not. And what I mean by that is this, okay? If I look at myself in the mirror every day, and I see myself and I'm like, man, Brian, you are so incredibly handsome, and the world is blessed to have you, okay? That is my perception of myself. May not be accurate, it's perception, okay? I'm going to behave that way. I am going to behave as if I am God's gift to the world, which is going to create a reality for me, isn't it? It's going to create a pretty self-centered, narcissistic reality for me, isn't it? Perception yields behavior, yields reality. The opposite is also true. If I look at myself every day in the mirror and I say, dude, you're worthless. You have no gifts or talents. You're not valuable to your church. Nobody really cares to listen to you. Why did you even get up this morning? I don't think I'm going to be skipping into the office that day, right? In fact, I'm probably going to have a pretty negative attitude about life in general, which is going to create a reality, isn't it? Perception yields behavior, yields reality. why this is so important is that we do this with our children all the time. We do this with students. We do this with coworkers all the time. We see a student, as educators, you may see a student, and they act out. They have behavioral issues. Okay. You start to tie their behavioral issues to their identity. So they're not a child making bad choices. They're a bad child. And so you start responding to them as a bad child. Perception yields behavior, yields reality. And then there's other students who, are great. They speak well, they're polite, they're full of manners, their parents are nice. You have a perception of them. They do a couple things wrong and they start to act out in the classroom, you give them a break. Because your perception of them is different than their behavior, which creates a whole other reality for them. As a parent, we often do this with our children. We punish them for their behavior, and when we punish them for their behavior, we tie it to their identity. We yell at them for making a bad choice, but instead of calling it a bad choice, we tell them they're bad for what they did. Guys, identity is incredibly important because perception yields behavior, yields reality. Now, what we have to identify in this, as we talk about identity, is what perceptions are true and what perceptions are false. That becomes extremely important, and we're actually going to dive into this. But it's necessary for us to understand that as we're living out our calling, as we're living out our purpose, how we perceive the people that God has placed around us often yields our behavior to them, which creates a reality that may not be what God actually desires. And so it's important that we understand how God sees us, right? What is God's perception of us? What is his behavior towards us? And what reality has that created? Perception yields behavior, yields reality. So let's go into that. God's transforming child. Go with me to 1 Peter chapter 2. Okay, 1 Peter chapter 2, right towards the end of the New Testament. This powerful, powerful passage. 1 Peter chapter 2, and we'll start with verse 9. Right? Peter's writing to a church that's really struggling. They're facing a lot of persecution. And so he's trying to encourage them with this. What does he say? He says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of the darkness and into his marvelous light. For once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, if you're in your own Bible, I'd encourage you to circle that word, beloved. I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." All right, this passage, this is tremendous. If you want to talk about identity, there are a few scripture passages that just scream it. All right, Ephesians chapter 2 is one of them. 1 Peter chapter 2 is one of them. He's talking again to this discouraged, this disheartened, this challenged group of believers because they're facing tremendous persecution. Okay, and so what does he say to them? He says, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of the darkness and into his marvelous light." So what Peter does is he's trying to change their perception. He's trying to remind them, actually, that their identity has already changed. Because their perception of themselves right now is that we're beaten down, we're crushed, we're downhearted, we have no value or worth. What's the point? So they're starting to act that way, and Peter's saying, whoa, stop. Do not create that reality. What is true about you is that you are a chosen race, a holy people, a royal nation. You are God's chosen people for his own possession. God, the creator of the universe, the one who came into our midst, died our death for us, was raised from the dead for our eternal life. God chose you to proclaim his glory, to pass the faith on from generation to generation to generation. Perception yields behavior, yields reality. Educator, what's your perception of yourself? And what behavior has that created? What reality do you now live in because your perception has yielded a certain kind of behavior? Because Peter's writing to you. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of the darkness and into his marvelous light. Peter is talking about you as an educator, as an intentional educator, utilizing those 1,300 hours that you have to impact the lives of your students, not just this year, but for years to follow. He's talking about you. He's talking about me. He's talking about the church. We are God's chosen race and royal priesthood. That should be our perception of ourselves. That God chose us and loves us and wants the best for us and works transformation within us as his disciples so that we more proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of the darkness and into his marvelous light. Verse 10, he says, once you were a people, were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you didn't have an identity. You didn't have worth or value, but now you do. Educator, I don't know what you struggle with on a daily basis. I'm not a teacher. Okay, I'm not an educator. I'm a pastor and I'm a speaker. So I don't necessarily know the struggles, but I would imagine that you have them. I know that my mother-in-law, who is an educator, has them. I know that my sister, who is an educator, has them. I know that friends who are educators have struggles. So I would venture to guess, by January, mid-year, you have had a significant amount of struggles. But your identity is not based on your success or your failure. Your identity is based on what God says about you. And God says you are beloved. Remember I told you to circle that word? It's right there. Verse 11, God says you are beloved. You are his chosen race, royal priesthood, holy nation. You as an intentional educator are these very things. You as a parent are these things. You as a coach and a mentor are these things. You as an employee and an employer are these things. Not just when you're at church, not just when you're in Bible study or with your small group or your discipling group. You are throughout your life. As you live out your calling, your purpose, you are these things. You are beloved. And as a beloved educator, what is the behavior that you use? How do you live your life? See, that's what we just spent session 1 talking about, right? Understanding that calling. Your perception of yourself as beloved, as a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, your understanding of yourself yields this behavior in your role as an educator, your role as a spouse, your role as a parent, a grandparent, neighbor, friend, everything else, which then transforms your reality. Because God is working through it all. All right, so let's dive into your understanding of your students. Because that's really what it means to be an intentional educator, doesn't it? God's transforming child. If I'm raising them up to be my student, if I'm seeing them as my student, I often see them as proud or self-centered or arrogant or impatient, or they have, sometimes they have a scorekeeper mentality, or they build barriers. They put walls up. I can't reach my students. I can't influence them. I can't get into their lives. I can't communicate with their parents. I don't feel like I'm making a difference. See, that's what happens when I see them as only my student. But when I see them as God's transforming child, the one that God is working in their life, the child that God sees as beloved, if I can see them as God's transforming children, I start to see them as humble. I start to see them as selfless. I start to see them as gentle. I start to see them as patient. There's opportunities to be grace-filled. I also sometimes see boundless mercy in them. Perception yields behavior, yields reality. And you're probably looking at that chart going, what? How in the world does that work? My perception of them doesn't change their behavior. You're right. It does change your behavior towards them. And so this is where we need to have a little bit of an honest talk. As an intentional educator, when you see your students, do you allow them the freedom to fail and to grow? And I know right off the bat you're going to say, yes, of course I do. Okay? Let's dive a little bit deeper into that. Do you allow your students the chance to fail and grow? I put that label on that chart, God's transforming child, for a reason. We often think that children should come into our classroom, or they're going to leave our classroom always being humble, or always being selfless, or always being gentle, or always being patient, always being grace-filled, always showing boundless mercy. Let me ask you a question. When was the last time that you have always been patient with your students throughout a school year? Yep, exactly. Okay? It doesn't happen that way. The journey of discipleship is not that I reach to the end and I get to put the check mark on and never worry about that again. No, the journey of discipleship is one that is constantly full of ups and downs. Ups and downs. I do it well, I do it badly. I do it well, I do it badly. I do it mediocre, I do it really badly. I do it mediocre, I do it really badly. All right? That's the journey of discipleship. That's what we struggle with as adults. As an educator, you know that every day of the school year is not going to be the perfect day. And you give yourself that grace oftentimes. Or you beat yourself up for it, don't you? Because my conversations with the educators, they don't necessarily give themselves grace, they beat themselves up on it. I could have been a better teacher today. Well, that may be true, but you're also human. You are a human who is beloved and chosen by God. Remember, the church is not built on success and perfection. The church is built on grace and forgiveness and mercy. Grace, forgiveness, and mercy are needed because the church is not perfect. That's the whole reason we needed a Savior, is because we couldn't do it. And so for God to call us his chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, he had to bring forgiveness to us and our Savior Jesus Christ. So brothers and sisters, fellow disciples, let me start this little section by saying, you are a transforming child of God. I do not expect perfection out of you. I expect growth and transformation. I expect to see you on a journey. I expect to see you go up and down, up and down, up and down, sideways and backwards, and every other which way, and then we make a little bit of forward progress. Because that is the life of a disciple, and that is what God expects of you. God doesn't expect perfection. That's why he sent his son, Jesus Christ. He does expect you to grow in obedience. And that's another presentation, so I won't go much further in that. But let me just say that as an educator, I don't expect you to do your job perfectly every day, especially not in our society and culture right now. Not in our season of the world where we're going through a pandemic and every day something different happens. I expect you to live in mercy and grace. I expect you to seek out truth. Because that's what it means to be beloved. A chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. That's what I expect out of you. So as an educator, when you look at your students, do you expect perfection and success, or do you expect growth and transformation? See, that's the difference between my student and God's transforming child. Is my student, they will always be. It's a law-based thing, isn't it? But if they're God's transforming child, I get to see transformation. I get to see them progress along the journey. I get to see them be transformed and changed as God's mercy and truth works in their lives. And maybe you noticed from that list, it's the fruit of the Spirit. From Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 5. It's the fruit of the Spirit. Yes, I know y'all have test scores that you have to meet. I know there's assessments that have to be done. I know there's certain criteria for a student to move from one year to the next, but none of those things should ever take away their identity in our Savior, Jesus Christ. And so how do you approach your classroom setting in a way that understands and you help your students understand, hey guys, we have to do these things. We need to take these assessments. But how do you do it in a way that doesn't take away their identity? I think it comes down to reminding them who they are in our Savior, Jesus Christ, first and foremost. And you as educators and Christian schools have some of the greatest opportunity to do this. You see, you can talk about those assessments. You can talk about things that they've done wrong. You can help them understand that pushing each other or speaking badly to each other or throwing the dodgeball at each other on the playground is not a good choice. But you can take it a step further back and say, it's not a good choice because as disciples, as beloved children of God, how do we interact with each other? I have to give you a 0 on this test because you cheated on it, but let's talk about why you cheated. And let's talk about why, as beloved children of God, that's not what He calls us to do. You see, you identify the behavior, but you're trying to actually show how the behavior does not align with their identity. So let me try to nail this down a little bit further. As a parent, how I talk to my children becomes really important when we need to discipline them, doesn't it? And so the conversations that I have with my son, I'll use him because he's older, and so we have a lot of conversations, and it's especially important as a dad to my son. When he gets in trouble, he does something he shouldn't do. I send him to his room, right? He has to go sit on his bed, or he has to go sit on our bed. And when I go in there, I have a few ways I could handle the situation, right? One day he screamed at his sister, literally screamed, top of the lungs screamed at his sister because he was so frustrated with something. And so I go into the bedroom and I can just say, Elijah, stop screaming. We do not talk to each other that way. Da-da-da-da-da. Okay? Now, notice my voice already rose, so I'm kind of contradicting my own message here when I would say that to him, right? So instead I can go into that room and I can sit down on the bed and I can say, Elijah, help me understand. What are you upset about? What is wrong? Well, she did it. I'm like, okay, Elijah, time out. Why does that upset you? Well, because it hurt my feelings. Okay, now we're on to something. So Elijah, how do we interact with each other in this family, in this household? Do we try to yell at each other like that? No. Well, why? Because it's not a nice way to talk to each other. Why is it important that we're nice to each other? Well, because we love each other. Perception yields behavior, yields reality by just taking an extra moment. I've started to help my son understand that his behavior needs to align with what is true about himself. He's a part of this family and he loves his sister, so his behavior should not be yelling at her, because yelling at her does not show he's a part of this family and does not show that he loves his sister. But because he's a part of this family, because he loves his sister, he has other options for behavior. He has other ways that he can handle the situation, and by doing so, he can then create a different reality. But if I constantly tie my son's behavior to his identity, if I say, I can't believe you got angry, you're angry all the time. Well, for starters, my son's not angry all the time. Making such a strong absolute like that is almost never true. All right? My son's not angry all the time, but at the same time, I've just tied a choice that he's made to something that is true about him versus calling it the choice that it is. All right? So again, if he's yelling at his sister, I'm trying to help him understand that yelling is a choice that he's made that does not line up with what is true about him. He is a part of this family and he loves his sister. What are some other choices he can make? And what is the reality that will come from that? That's how I'm encouraging you to understand what it means to see your students as God's transforming children. Just because they cheated on a test does not make them a cheater for life. Just because they sit quietly in the corner doesn't make them worthless. Just because they act out in bad behaviors in your classroom does not make them a bad person. And I know that we understand that at some level, right? But too often that's not how we live it out. The kids that constantly challenge us, the kids that constantly act out in our classrooms are like, oh, I can't stand that kid. I don't want them to be in my classroom today. I'm too tired for this. God never says that about us. God always says to us, you're my beloved redeemed child. Did you screw it up today? Yes. Did you make a bad choice today? Yes. But you are always my beloved and redeemed child in my son Jesus Christ. Your behavior does not take away your identity with me. That's what God says to us. So how do we say that to our students? How do we take that extra measure, that extra step to try to understand their behavior and their perception that's leading to it? Because you know that kid sitting in the corner, he may think that he's worthless because nobody talks to him, including his teacher. So what if you intentionally walked over and started talking to him? Or that kid that always acts out in class and always seems to have behavioral issues and you just can't understand why, and you know they constantly scream or push or they're biting other kids, all right? What if you took that extra step to try to understand why? And the hard thing is with little kids, they may not be able to verbalize it, right? They may not be able to tell you this is what I'm struggling with. But there's ways you can figure it out. One of our twins, Esther, is a biter. She is a biter, all right? And she will bite her sister, Naomi. And she will often leave teeth marks. So we finally had enough kids that we have a biter in the house. And anyway, so, Naomi will come screaming bloody murder down the hallway. She's coming, running down the hallway. We pick her up. We're like, what's wrong? We see the marks. We're like, Esther, come here. And Esther comes in. She goes, I bite. Now, my 2-year-old daughter is not able to fully comprehend or to share why she's biting, okay? She's not really grasping the perception yields behavior yields reality issue. However, as a dad, I have a couple of options in this situation, don't I? One of them is to immediately punish her and set the law down, go throw her in her room, and, you're it. That's it. No more biting. Well, what happens when she bites again? Do I do the same punishment? Do I do a worse punishment? Do I ever reach a point where I can't punish her enough for the behavior that she's doing? The answer is yes to that question, by the way. Or do I use that moment to model for Esther and for Naomi what it means to seek forgiveness from each other, so that they begin to understand that even when they make a bad choice, they can still seek forgiveness and give forgiveness. See, that's actually what we do with our girls. So when Naomi comes screaming down the hall, she's got the bite mark on her arm, and Esther's like, I bite. We sit them both down and we say, Esther, I need you to apologize to Naomi. She'll just look at us sometimes. No. Okay, if you're not going to apologize, then you're going to go sit in your room. Omi, I sorry. Give her a hug. Okay. Now, girls, we don't act like this to each other. Esther, stop biting, baby, because it's not being nice. It's not showing love to Naomi. Now, I realize she's 2 years old, so she's not going to fully grasp and comprehend everything that we're trying to tell her, but she will start understanding that, won't she? They will also understand that there's opportunities to show forgiveness to each other. There's also opportunities to show that they are being transformed. And as a parent to my son Elijah, or to Charlotte, or to the girls, or to my wife Victoria, how do I show that I'm a transforming child of God to impact their life of faith? There have been times where, I've gotten upset with my children, and I've had to go into the room, and I've had to say, guys, Daddy needs to talk to you. I'm sorry that I did whatever it was. Do you forgive me? And I've been able to model for them that I too am a transforming child of God. I'm using that opportunity that I have as a dad, part of those 3,000 hours, to model for them that life of discipleship. And so as an educator, when you think about your classroom, how you interact with your students says a lot about your perception of them, right? How you interact with your students says a lot about your perception of them and how you identify that behavior with them. And so that kid who's always sitting in the corner, do you ignore them? Do you try to address them? Do you go and intentionally talk with them? To the kid who's behaving badly every day, do you try to have a intentional further conversation to understand what may be happening in their life, or do you just constantly address the behavior? Right? See, the biggest piece in all of this is if we just address the behavior, we start to tie the behavior to their identity. We start to understand them as an individual through their behavior. It's the opposite is actually supposed to be true. We understand their behavior through their identity. I mean, that's the whole point that I'm trying to make here is we're trying to understand our students' behavior through their identity, not the other way around. So if I see the kid sitting in the corner who doesn't interact with anybody, do I identify them by that behavior, or do I identify them by the conversations I get to have with them? Maybe they are truly shy and they just need a little bit of encouragement and building up to see that they have value and worth in the classroom. Can I give them confidence to raise up their identity, their perception of themselves, which leads to more confident behavior in the classroom? To the kid who's acting up, do I always refer to them based on their behavior, or do I try to go behind and say, help me understand who you are, Joey? What's leading to this behavior? Start with identity. Start with perception, which helps us better understand behavior, which helps us then better understand reality. If we see them as God's transforming children, if we start from that perception, then we can help them better align their behavior to be more humble and selfless and gentle and patient and grace-filled and boundless in mercy. We can help them live out the fruit of the Spirit. So now what? Now what? All right, let's kind of wrap this up. Have you taken away their identity? Really ask yourself, am I giving a critique or am I giving a criticism? You see, critique identifies the issue with the behavior, the attitude, or the outcome. Criticism identifies it with the person. So am I critiquing them or am I criticizing them? Okay? Am I leading with trust? This is where the conversation around boundaries and barriers comes up in this intentional educator presentation is understanding that I need to trust that they're going to make the right decision. Too often we structure classrooms, we structure organizations, we structure our household as parents based on fear that they're going to do the wrong thing or that the wrong thing is going to happen. Instead, what if I trusted that God is working in them? What if I trust that even when they fail, even when they mess up, even when they make a bad choice, that they're still God's beloved child and that He is still working transformation in them? It's going to change how I structure my classroom. And if you would like to learn more about boundaries and barriers and what that means, an intentional educator, we can certainly have that conversation. But when you don't lead with trust, when you don't trust your students to do the right thing, you start to take away their identity. And it becomes a criticism versus a critique. Are your students going to make bad choices? Yes. Are your students going to break the rules? Yes. Does that make them any less loved by God? It's important that we remember that. And then potential versus destiny. When you think about your students, I think about it. I think about the students I've seen in confirmation kids, whoever it is. I know the ones who have strong potential. But every student has strong potential. Does that mean every student can be president of the United States? No. Does that mean every student has a purpose in God's kingdom? Yes. And so as an intentional educator, how do you help them understand their purpose, their gift set, their skill set, their purpose in God's kingdom? Because not every student is meant to be the top student in the class. If that were true, there wouldn't be a top student. Help them understand what their purpose is in God's kingdom and watch that come alive. Right? Too much of our educational system is built on this idea that if you don't reach this point, you have failed or you're not as successful as somebody else. It's not how God's kingdom works. God's kingdom works in the way that He says, you all are my people. You all are my beloved, my chosen race, royal priesthood, holy nation. All of you are. And each of you serves a different purpose. Some of you, it's to preach. Some of you, it's to teach. Some of you, it's to evangelize. Some of you, it's to be a good neighbor. Some of you, it's to be an excellent housewife. Some of you, it's to be an extra stay-at-home mom. Some of you, it's to be an extra great leader in your organization. Some of you, it's to be a stay-at-home dad. Every person has a purpose in God's kingdom. We assign success and failure in our society. God does not. God says, first and foremost, you are my beloved and my redeemed. I have a purpose for you. Live it out. And so as an intentional educator, when we're talking with our students, do we help them understand that success in life is not based on how much money they make or what their status is in our community? Do we help them understand that success in life is living out God's purpose in their lives? You really want to use that 1,300 hours you have as an intentional educator? Help them understand what it means to live out God's purpose in their lives. Dive into their gift set. Dive into their passions, their dreams, their heart. And help them see it. Don't take away their identity. Understand your identity impacts theirs. All right, that was the second point on the slide. Understand that your identity impacts theirs. Your perception of yourself yields your behavior, which yields your reality. Do you see yourself as God's transforming child? Who's going to have good days and bad days, who's going to have success and failure, but through it all, you're still God's beloved child. Because that will change how you interact with your students, with your teammates, with your coworkers, with your organization, with your church, which will create a reality. Understand that your identity, your understanding of your identity, impacts theirs. You know, we talked about it at the end of the last session, is that to grow disciples, we need to be discipled. If I want to disciple and use the most of the time that I've been given, if I want to have that greater impact and influence for generations to come, that means I need to grow in my faith too. First and foremost, I need to grow in my faith so that I can help others along their journey. Perception yields behavior, yields reality. All right, so some next steps here, all right? Preparing them to launch. Remember, this is ways that you can impact them in the 1,300 hours that you've been given for the years to follow, all right? For the next steps in their lives. So preparing them to launch. Here we go. Post-it note encouragements. Put it on their desk, their locky, their cubby, and put some on your own desk, your computer, and your mirror. Verbalize an encouragement or compliment for each student at least one time a day, and then share how you've seen your student model their identity as God's transforming child. All right, let's dive into each of these just a little bit. Post-it note encouragements. One of the hardest things I think educators have to deal with is that sometimes you are the only positive influence in your student's life, and that's incredibly disheartening. And you think that 1,300 hours versus 3,000 hours, I mean, that's not a match, right? However, when I talk to them as adults, I wish you could hear the stories that I get to hear of teachers who have impacted a student. And you know, sometimes it's a high school teacher, sometimes it's a middle school teacher, but a lot of times it's an elementary school teacher. Somebody who really poured into them early on in their life and just set them on a different direction. So educator, please do not forget the tremendous amount of influence your 1,300 hours can have in the life of your students and the lives of their families. I've actually talked with parents who were transformed in their life of faith because of their child who was a student in this teacher's classroom. The teacher poured into the student poured into their parents. Your 1,300 hours is tremendously impactful. And something as simple as a post-it note of encouragement on their desk or their locker, their cubby, can make a world of difference to them. And I'll also say that, you know, as a parent, one of the coolest things that I've gotten to receive is to see a note of encouragement for my son in his folder that I had to read. The encouragement was for my son, but because as his dad I had to read it, it brought such joy to my heart. And it impacted me. So his teacher trying to impact her student has impacted me. So share those encouragements. That second one, verbalize that encouragement or compliment for each student at least one time per day. Because again, sometimes your classroom is the only positive environment your student may be in. Even the most picture-perfect families struggle with it. And what it also does is by verbalizing that for each student one time a day, you model and you set the standard in your classroom. You model and you set the standard that our classroom is going to be a place of encouragement. Our classroom is going to be a place of building up. Our classroom is going to be a place where we can encourage and celebrate the success of each other. That's something that your students need later on in life. They need to be able to team well with other people. They need to be able to encourage and celebrate the joys and the successes of other people, because that's adulthood, right? That's working in a team setting. That's working with other adults on a project. So if you really want to prepare your students to launch, to prepare them for further on in life, verbalize an encouragement, a compliment for each student one time a day. Okay? And then lastly, that share how you've seen your student model their identity as God's transforming child. Call it out. Say, hey, I just witnessed humility in you. What an amazing thing. Or I just loved how you showed forgiveness to each other. Call it out. Show that you want to see them as God's transforming children. And as you call those things out, especially in younger children, they start to change their behavior to model that. Right? They start to want to do that because they want to be seen as loved, and they want to be known and seen by their teacher, by the authorities in their lives. So if you start pointing out ways that they're living out as God's transforming children, you'll start to see behavior change in your classroom. But it also sets up the opportunity that your classroom as a place of encouragement and building up is not a classroom based on success or failure. It's a classroom based on love and truth. Because when you're modeling that and calling out God's transforming child, it's also taking the opportunity to say, hey, next time let's try harder on this because I know you have it in you. Or hey, next time, how can we better use your passions in this way, in a positive way? And your classroom becomes a place of growth and transformation versus assessing success or failure. Because as an intentional educator, as a disciple along the journey of discipleship, as one who's discipling others, God's kingdom is about growth and transformation, not success and failure. Use the 1,300 hours that you have to make an influence in the lives of your students, not just now, not just presently, but into the life of the future. Blessings as you live as an intentional educator. You're in my prayers. And I pray that God is working that transformation first and foremost in you so that you can work that transformation in the lives of your students. If you ever want to reach out, if you ever want to learn more, if you are interested in bringing intentional educator or intentional parenting to your school, to your church, to your community, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find me at disciplespeakerfacilitator.com. That information is shared in your participants guide. Again, you can follow me on Facebook, on Instagram. I try to post encouraging things and also times where I failed and need to be shown mercy and grace. I try to show that intentional journey of discipleship and how God is using the people that He's placed around me to grow and transform me so that I can do the same for those that He's placed in my life. You're in my prayers. I pray God's blessings upon you, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thanks, guys.